I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our Grassroots Advocacy webinar series being hosted by the Cancer Policy Institute of the Cancer Support Community. My name is Rob Goldsmith and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director here at CSC. We are so happy that you could join us today for our webinar on grassroots advocacy at the federal level. This is the third in a series of webinars that we are hosting on a monthly basis. For those that aren't familiar with our organization, this slide gives a brief overview of the cancer support community. CSC is an international patient advocacy nonprofit dedicated to providing support, education, and hope to those affected by cancer. Our organization includes over 170 locations across the country. These affiliates provide direct services, including social and emotional support, available free of charge to millions around the country impacted by cancer. We also have an extensive research arm with our Research and Training Institute in Philadelphia. Finally, there is our advocacy work being done through the Cancer Policy Institute. This includes our Grassroots Network and the webinar that you are participating in today. This slide is just a brief biography that covers my background. I was pleased to join the cancer support community as the Director of Policy and Advocacy in February of this year. Previously, in my previous role, I served on the staff of former Congressman Bruce Braley from Iowa. I was a senior legislative assistant for him and worked in his congressional office. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. All participants are invited to ask questions at any point during the presentation. If you have a question for our speakers, please type your question in the Q&A field at the bottom right of your screen, and we will answer as many of your questions as possible. Also, we highly encourage you to visit our Grassroots Advocacy website to take a look at our previous webinars that we've done. You can go to cscadvocate.org to view those previous webinars. It's now my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight's webinar. Mike Goodman currently serves as Chief of Staff for Congressman Ron Kind of Wisconsin. Mike has 15 years of experience in the political and policy arenas, having a deep understanding of the legislative and regulatory process, as well as senior management experience in the House of Representatives. Mike has managed a broad spectrum of policy issues with a specialty in healthcare and has successfully executed long-term policy and political strategies, including the authorship, introduction, passage, and implementation of numerous federal laws. I had the privilege of working with Mike for over 8 years in the office of former Congressman Bruce Braley. Mike will be discussing his role as the Chief of Staff for a member of Congress, and we'll be talking about how you, as an advocate, can make real changes in federal policy. So, Mike, without further ado, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. I really appreciate Rob and Cancer Support Community asking me to be on this webinar. Advocacy is a skill. So hopefully we can just talk a little bit about that. But I'm very familiar with the CSC office in D.C., with just about everybody in the office, and Rob and the rest of the team have just been a great help to me and Congressman Kind and the rest of our congressional office. So we just really appreciate all of the assistance that you've all given to us. Just a couple more notes about me. I handled healthcare policy for a long time, most of my 10 years on the Hill. I've kind of been around in politics and policy, worked at the gubernatorial level, worked at the congressional level, and worked at the state house level and the legislative level in Georgia. Spent a lot of time doing Georgia, Iowa, and Wisconsin politics, and most recently, I'm serving as Chief of Staff to Ron Kind of Western and Central Wisconsin. I've also had the opportunity to work for great bosses who have been on the two health-related committees in the House, which is Energy and Commerce Committee and the Subcommittee on Health there, that former Congressman Braley was on when I was his legislative director, and Congressman Kind is on the Subcommittee on Health on Ways and Means Committee, which looks at a lot of health funding and Medicare and other issues that relate to money in the healthcare system. And so I'm lucky to be able to continue to help in the healthcare field working for Congressman Kind. I'll mention what the day-to-day job is of a chief on the Hill, and then maybe give a couple examples of times when I've seen advocacy at the grassroots level turn into a change in law. My day primarily consists of trying to keep the trains running with the different parts of the congressional office, which really boil down to legislative, which is what the congressman spends the bulk of his time on, and communications or press, and then logistics, which is a lot of scheduling and just getting through the day sometimes. But legislative is really the area where Ron and most other members put most of their focus and put their thinking into. That involves knowing what votes are coming up, figuring out background on those votes, the congressman making sure that he has the right materials and just knows the ins and outs of things that come up, especially when votes kind of surprise everyone, which happens. It involves committee work, which takes a lot of time, but committee hearings and committee markups where we're moving bills through committee to try to pass them out of committee to get them to the floor. And another part of the legislative world is meeting with constituents and meeting with advocacy organizations and hearing their stories and hearing their asks and learning about bills that often we may not even know have been introduced, but learning about them from an advocacy group or constituent who's flagging it and asking for support. I would say in our office, between the staff and the boss, we probably have about 50 to 60 meetings a week on average. And given just the amount of time that, of course, that the congressman has when he is dealing with votes and committees and things like caucus meetings and other just meetings happening, briefings, then it means that the staff are actually the ones taking most of the meetings. At least for Ron, he tries to meet with any constituent that comes to town. It's not always possible, but that's the goal. But it does mean that there are plenty of times when there are other meetings happening that it's the staff taking the meeting. Our general process is we have a week of meetings and other, phone calls come in, letters come in. The staff is organizing everything. So they're organizing what the asks were and the stories were from individual meetings. They're organizing the quantity of letters and emails coming in about certain issues. And at the end of the week, we go through that at the staff level, and that's when we run through a lot of asks that have come into the congressman that he may not even know about yet, which are, please co-sponsor this bill, please, sign this letter going to Speaker Boehner urging him to do this, that, or the other. Please sign this letter going to Department of Health and Human Services urging them to do this, that, or the other. Please vote this way on a vote that may be coming up in the next couple weeks, and so on. We get all that organized. For things that are phone calls and letters, they go through the process, and we know, 100 people called this week urging you to vote yes on this particular bill. So the numbers matter too. Then early in the week, the next week, the congressman gets all that, sometimes verbally, often in written form, because things like bills will end up needing a fair amount of research, and then that's when a lot of the decisions get made. But one takeaway from that is don't underestimate the job of the staff. And sometimes there will be plenty of times when the congressperson who is just one person, will be pulled away for some scheduling thing that's out of his control, like votes or committee hearings. And you may end up getting staff, but they often are the ones who are putting the materials together for the congressperson to see and then, decide where to be on a particular bill. A few examples of when I've seen this process really play out over time and lead to real meaningful change. Two have come to mind as I've been thinking about this webinar. There are a number of them over the years, but two in particular. Back before the Affordable Care Act, we were hearing from a number of caregivers of Alzheimer's patients and the Alzheimer's advocacy organizations. And one of the things that they had realized within their disease groups had realized that they were having trouble knowing what was proper care for an Alzheimer's patient, and knowing how to measure that. So they had no way of telling if patients were getting good care across the board, if they're at this stage in the disease, should they be getting this type of care when in fact they're getting this type of care, measurements of the drugs that were out there. They just didn't know how to measure those things, and no one was measuring those things. This became part of a larger goal that we now see with the healthcare system as a whole, which is moving towards this idea of measuring the quality of the care provided, and then using that to then incentivize providers and try to make sure, that providers and the system as a whole and hospitals and so on are providing good care. For example, knowing that psychosocial care does impact outcomes, and kind of the goals of providing, making sure that there are incentives for that too. Rewinding, the Alzheimer's constituents who we're hearing from, often it was the caregivers and the groups were saying we need HHS to look at how to measure quality outcomes so that we can then figure out how to make sure quality outcomes are occurring at a broader level. We asked them to help us put language together. They came to us. We heard, this is when I was with Bruce Braley in Iowa, so we heard from some Iowans about it. They helped us put language together because, we needed their expertise to give us ideas of what would be quality metrics, or at least enough to even ask the right questions of Health and Human Services. We put a bill together. We introduced the bill, and then the Affordable Care Act was coming up, and we realized that's our opportunity to pass it. And through a lot of advocacy of other offices, which was many just constituents all across the country getting the support of other members of Congress for the Braley initiative, we were able to get it included in the larger Affordable Care Act, and it was, one tiny little provision in that bill, but then went on and got passed along with the rest of the bill. So now they are making strides on figuring out what constitutes high-quality care for those patients, and then finding ways to, encourage that higher quality and more effective care around the country. Another example of advocacy at a very grassroots level was we got a call, this was also with Braley in a district office, about a veteran. It was from a friend of a veteran, and he said, my friend has applied for a grant from the VA to make his house more accessible to him because he's in a wheelchair, and his son is also in a wheelchair, but the veteran's disability was service-connected. They had applied for this housing grant from the VA, and it had been bogged down for, I believe, 2 years, and they just weren't hearing anything. The staff began calling over to the VA. The congressman began calling over, and we managed to get him his grant, which was very exciting. We then met with him, and over time, some months later, we saw what they did with their house. They actually were able to build a new house that was handicapped accessible. that was inspiring, and that's when the congressman said, we should make sure that this grant is available to as many of these. Many of these are severely disabled veterans, as can use it. So we went back and looked at the policy behind the grant and learned it was underfunded, learned it actually had an expiration date on it, learned that there were trade-offs, that veterans had to be making decisions if they wanted just temporary help in a place like staying with a family member. Just getting a wheelchair ramp could mean that they would no longer be able to get the grant for their own house down the road. And we wrote a bill, named it after this veteran that we had helped, introduced it, and over time, through sharing his story, he actually came and testified for Congress and talked about his spinal cancer that he had. Over time, through telling his story, we were able to get enough support to actually move that bill, and we're able to pass it into law, which now his widow and their son, who is disabled, are just very grateful for that, and they still are in the house that now the son is able to get around in because it's accessible to him, and it means that this bill that is named after this gentleman is now part of U.S. law, and it's helping thousands of other veterans that are disabled. So those are just a couple examples of where constituent outreach and advocacy groups working with constituents, and sometimes even just an individual person just calling the office, have actually resulted in changes of law that are now having ramifications for probably thousands of people across the country. I think as you're thinking about doing more grassroots advocacy, one of the most potent tools that you have is telling the stories of the patients that you interact with, the caregivers that you interact with, and telling the stories about what you do day to day, what your job is. I think one of the biggest worries that we have to counteract is people becoming statistics. We see it in all kinds of issues. We're seeing it right now in some of the news, that when people are having in challenging times, like cancer patients, that lawmakers get so concerned with the sheer numbers that everyone just becomes a number. And that makes it a lot easier to discount, someone or a group of people. So I think just one of the most important things you can do as you're pushing for policy change is to make sure that you have real-world examples of patients or families or something that you've seen in your job that you can relate to that policy change, and that just might help that member or that staffer when they're talking to that member of Congress kind of put a real face on something and not just think about the numbers. So that's my pitch. Rob, thanks again for having me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Mike. That was really a couple of really good examples, I think, and really great stories that you shared with us. And we're really happy to have you offering your expertise and experience. So I do have one question here from one of our affiliate leaders that I'm wondering if you can answer for us. And it's regarding cancer care policy. And the question is, the number of cancer patients in the U.S. is expected to drastically increase in the coming years. Can you tell us what Congress has done this year to address this potentially drastic increase in new cancer patients?
Yes, yep, there is work being done. Sometimes it seems like it gets lost in the shuffle of the 24-hour news cycle, but it is happening. The big push right now and this year has been for 21st century cures, which will do a couple good things. One is improving the pathway of drugs for cancer patients and other drugs to get onto the market. Maintaining safety, maintaining FDA oversight, but kind of getting through the clog, especially when there's something that could prove very helpful to individuals with cancer. So it basically makes improvements to the pathway to get drugs out there when they're needed. It also makes significant investments in National Institutes of Health, NIH, which is also one of the keys to us maintaining treatments and drugs and just quality care in the long term is making those investments in the research, and that's what led to many of the most effective drugs and treatments now. And then I also should mention, just over time, over the last few years, really the Affordable Care Act is probably has been one of the best single policy initiatives, I think, for cancer patients, between just having millions more people with health insurance, free preventative care, including mammograms and other things that can actually save lives and save a lot of money in the long run. No longer being able to deny insurance based on pre-existing conditions, all those things. We continue to see implementation of that occur, and we continue to see it kind of grow as a tool and as a policy. And so that's something else that I think has probably had a huge impact on cancer patients. But right now, the work on the Hill is around 21st century cures, which does help address those two problems of kind of getting drugs and treatments out into the market quicker for the things that we need out there quicker, and also having a significant investment in NIH.
Great. So another question that just came in. One of the things, Mike, that we encourage our members that are members of the network to do is to write their legislators, and we've done several engagements over the past few months encouraging them to write their representative or senator directly, to urging them to improve and make and for quality cancer care. And so this question comes from one of our members, and they're wondering, when they send a letter or email to their representative, does someone actually read their letter, and is their opinion taken into consideration?
I think in most offices the answer is yes and yes. It certainly is in Congressman Kine's office. Every office probably does things a little differently. I'm sure there are people that have written in and feel like it's a black hole because they never get a response. And that's because you have 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, essentially 535 small businesses out there who all run things a little differently. But generally speaking, I think the vast majority of offices do try to be responsive to constituents. And what that means is there is a staff person or a few whose job is actually to read every single one of those that comes in, also to take the phone calls and record them. There's usually a form that they take the phone call, record it, and they will make sure the congressman knows. They then quantify it all. There's software that helps do this. So everyone is read, it's tagged as to what it is, the issue, the stance, the bill, and then it's quantified. And how we do our process, for example, is Ron, the boss, he'll know how many people contacted us about this bill in favor or opposed, how many people contacted us about this, something that the Department of Health and Human Services is doing, some big rulemaking, support, opposed, or things that are more nuanced. He'll also get probably around 10 or so a week of constituent correspondence that he'll read, that'll be in his folder. So he is getting to read a sampling of the thousands that come in, and he's also getting quantifiable numbers of everything that's come in, and that then becomes a part of the discussion, on how he's going to vote on some bill is we have those numbers as just one more piece, and then that clearly plays an impact then, and is part of that discussion. So they are getting read. Not everyone is getting read by the member, him or herself, but they are generally getting tallied, and it's a democratic way to do it. That the numbers matter, and when we have overwhelming calls or emails about something, then it definitely makes a big difference in the decision making.
Great. So one final question, Mike, and this is another one from one of our grassroots members. This person's going to be traveling to Washington, D.C. in the next couple of months to meet with their representative, and they're wondering what tips or advice you can offer when they go in to meet with their member of Congress.
Thanks. That's a good question. Number one would be take the advice of the CSC staff, because they do know what they're talking about. But generally speaking, I would say don't be frustrated if you end up getting staff. Hopefully the member will make a point to see you and really make it happen if you're a constituent. But there's always a chance that, committee hearings or votes are called, and those are, at the end of the day, that's what they get paid to do, is go cast those votes. So sometimes they can't skip those. So sometimes it just works out where you end up with staff. So just know that can happen, and it's normal. But also, I think the main thing is to tell those personal stories. You do want to have your ask, your policy push, and that's where you want everyone on the same page within your organization and your coalitions. But the thing I think that will cement it and will make it stand out over the other 50 meetings, all happening that week, or it might be 10 meetings that day is someone is taking. The thing that'll make it stand out is a story, something that you've seen or experienced, and how you relate that to the policy. Just can't overstate that enough, because those are the memorable things, I think, for all of us. So that's what you want them to remember, is your story or the story you've told about this patient, and maybe how their situation could have been a little better or could have been different if this policy change had occurred.
Great. Well, thank you again, Mike. We really appreciate you being able to take the time with us here tonight to share your expertise with us. We can't thank you enough on behalf of the cancer support community, and I know that you have another commitment and aren't able to be on the rest of the call, but we're just happy that you were able to be on and share some stories and talk about your role in working for Congressman Kind, and we really just can't thank you enough.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate it. Thanks for the chance to talk about what we do, and I wish you all the best of luck, because you're fighting the good fight. So please keep it up and get people on board.
Great.
So thanks.
Thanks. Yep. Take care. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Great. It's now my privilege to turn things over to our main presenter for tonight's webinar. Zina, Cary, who was also the presenter for our previous two webinars, has more than 2 decades of experience impacting public policy and leading advocacy efforts at the federal, state, and local levels. Zina has held various positions, including with the International Myeloma Foundation, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and the National Health Council. She also served as a legislative analyst for a New York State Assemblyman. Zina will also be talking to us in more detail about some of these different tools that Mike kind of overviewed during his keynote speech. So Zina, without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and kick things over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us tonight. I am very excited to be here this evening to talk with you about, a great subject near and dear to my heart, which is federal advocacy. So before I dive into the next many slides, I just want to give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering this evening. First is, what is federal advocacy? Then we'll be talking about, and this will be a common theme throughout the presentation, and it was great because Mike he mentioned, one of the things he mentioned in his presentations was the importance of sharing your story. So that will be a common theme throughout the presentation this evening. Share your story, how to do it, and why it's important. And then we'll give a primer of the overview of the policymaking process at the federal level. Then we're going to delve into a little bit about how do you develop a plan, meaning an advocacy plan, once you've identified an issue that needs to be addressed. Then we're going to give a couple of examples, really great, meaty examples of federal advocacy, successful federal advocacy. Then we're going to talk about advocacy activities that you can launch to support your efforts to change policy. Then we'll talk about the role of the media, meaning earned media and social media, in all that we do in advocacy. Then we're going to outline some resources to help, just to give you a sense of where to start with all of this. And then we'll wrap it up with how do you take action, how do you get rolling with everything that you've learned tonight. I just want to take a quick pause to say that I think some questions have been rolling in, which is great. Please, as we move through this presentation tonight, please type your questions in the Q&A field on the bottom right, and we will answer as many questions as we can. So what is federal advocacy? Let's start with the definition of advocacy and activism. The act or process of supporting a cause or proposal. It's also the doctrine or practice that emphasizes direct and vigorous action. So let's run through some types of advocacy. And this is federal advocacy, but this applies to advocacy at any level, whether it's the local, state, or the federal level. Starting with community advocacy. A good example of community advocacy is when a group of residents, and there have been many high-profile examples of this kind over the years, where residents of a local community come together to advocate against the construction of a manufacturing plant or a dump site for garbage, and because they believe it could be results in the release of toxic substances in the air. So this is just one example of community advocacy, but it's any time that a community comes together to push back on something that they know will be particularly harmful to them or their community, or it can be a positive in more of like a proactive way where, let's say it's a poor community and they want to see a clinic built. Community advocacy can come together around to help get that clinic built. Healthcare advocacy. A good example of healthcare advocacy is really around direct services. So if you're in an organization or you're a patient or a family member, navigating the healthcare system, you're dealing with direct services, to an individual or a family. Then that's really healthcare advocacy. Then there's political advocacy, which is really where we get into the political side of things. So it's your political campaigns, whether it's for the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate at the federal level, or in your own state where there's the governor, there's your state assembly or House of Representatives or your state Senate, and then your very local level political advocacy where it's your city council person or your county legislator. So those are really great examples of political advocacy, but getting involved and trying to have your issue highlighted in that kind of realm of political campaigns, that's another way to do advocacy around your issue. Then there's research advocacy. A good example of this is when you want to get your issue highlighted is to become a member of a community advisory board of your closest comprehensive cancer center. And then there's the final type of advocacy, which is self-advocacy. And I think every day in our daily lives we have to act as our own advocates. But a lot of times it's particularly true for cancer patients and their families or their caregivers, where you have to work with your team of doctors to make sure that your plan is on target, but also just to make sure that you're getting the best care possible. So I think self-advocacy is something that we do every single day, particularly if you're struggling to beat cancer. So what's the difference between state and federal advocacy? I think the duties, there's definitely distinctive duties that the federal government is charged with versus state. There are many times when those duties intersect with each other. And so on the federal side, the primary role of the federal government is to pass bills to change policies on a range of national issues. These include national defense. In our world, meaning health policy world, health advocacy world, clinical trial oversight, and drug approval are just a couple of examples. And then on the federal side, they also set the federal spending priorities for programs like education, national defense, public insurance, health insurance programs, meaning programs like Medicare and the Veterans Administration. And they do this along with the president. On the state side, their job is to pass bills that change policy on a range of issues, including health insurance, public schools, and something we all use, the DMV, Division of Motor Vehicles. Just a few examples. And then they're also charged with setting state budgets and spending priorities for issues like education and public health care programs, like Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act insurance marketplace, among others. And again, they do this with the executive branch of the state, meaning the governor of that particular state. So who becomes an advocate? In our world, in the health advocacy world, I think there's definitely a few typical folks that become advocates. So are you newly diagnosed or at another stage of cancer? Are you the family member or the loved one of someone with cancer? Are you a caregiver? And are you a provider and a social worker who works with cancer patients? These are all great examples of folks who become advocates in our world, meaning the health advocacy world. What's the criteria to become a federal-based advocate? Do you have to go to school for this? We're all advocates, and so the answer to that is no. There's really no special training at any level to become an advocate. It really takes passion and dedication, and small actions can make big changes. I think that's something that is really an important theme in all of this work, is that you don't have to go to Yale or Harvard to become an effective, strong advocate. And small actions, you don't have to get on a plane and fly to Washington, although that's great to go to Washington and do a lobby day. But you can also make a huge difference by writing a letter to your congressperson or your senator, or by making a phone call or sending an email. These are all seemingly small actions that can lead to big changes. Couple of ways to really be an effective advocate. One, you want to be passionate and dedicated, and you have to understand that these are hard issues, and that generally it's a marathon, not a sprint, to change the policy. And then it's also really important to become an expert in your issue area. Just have your facts straight, know it inside and out, and that just makes you a much more effective and stronger advocate. Sharing your story. Again, it's going to be a common theme as we roll through the presentation tonight, but I can't overemphasize the importance of sharing your story. Here's why it matters. Sharing your story, it puts a face on an issue. It educates policymakers and others, including the media, about your disease, the problem, and what you've identified as the best solution to the problem. And at the end of the day, sharing your story can mean the difference between changing policy and not changing policy. One example that I use a lot, and it's just one of many that I've experienced over the course of my 20-some years of doing this type of work, was we had been working for 2.5 years to pass a bill in New York State that would, lower the price of what folks who need oral chemotherapies need dramatically. And we thought we were coming into the last 6 weeks of the legislative session in Albany, and we thought we were dead in the water once again. And then all of a sudden, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, we found what we knew was going to be the quote-unquote perfect story. And we took that story and we pitched it to reporters. We got the Wall Street Journal, we got the New York Times, we got the Associated Press to write stories about it. We got on radio. We did a lobby day. We talked to legislators ad nauseum. We really, really generated a lot of important energy around it, and that story is what put us over the edge. And within 6 weeks before the end of session, we got the bill passed, by both houses of the legislature, and it was on its way to the governor's desk, and was signed into law a couple of months later. So that's a really great example of how one person's story can really turn the tide and make a major difference. So how do you share your story? Just a few key elements that you need. Nothing fancy. Keep it simple, but you want to start by making it personal. You also want to describe how the issue that you're talking about has impacted you and or your family and loved ones. Be clear and concise about the change that is needed. And then this last one, it's this bit of advice I was given when I first became an organizer many moons ago. Someone who I really admired and learned from said to me, things only change when they're local, urgent, and scary. So when you're telling your story, make it local, urgent, and make it scary. Make them listen. So here's just a few tips for finding patient stories. Many of you on this webinar, I'm sure, are in a position where you're tackling an issue and you know that finding good patient stories is going to be the thing that really helps to move your issue along. So these are just a few tips on where to look for these stories within your organization or in other ways. Now we're going to move into the policy-making process. And I think many of you, I'm sure all of you remember from civics class in high school, and many of you are professionals in the field, so you know this, but I think it's always good to just kind of run through this information again. We'll start very basically with the three branches of government. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch is charged with making the laws, the appropriate funds for laws and programs, they have treaties and executive appointments, and they establish the federal court. Then you have the executive branch, which of course is the President of the United States, who enforces the law. He or she acts as the commander-in-chief of the military. They negotiate treaties, and they appoint federal judges and other top officials, among other duties. Then you have your judicial branch, which they interpret the laws, they review lower court decisions, they judge whether a law and or executive actions are constitutional, and they rule on cases between states, among other things. Let's get into a little more of the meat and potatoes here of each branch, starting with the United States President. Our president is elected to a 4-year term, and they are term limited, so they only serve 2 terms, 8 years total. The person must be at least 35 years of age and a natural-born citizen, and they change policy, meaning they can issue executive orders, introduce legislation and regulation if there's a policy they'd like to see changed.
So, Zina, I'd like to just add something here, because I think that point about making policy, I think, is very relevant today in current events, because what you're seeing right now is President Obama has decided to use that authority pretty widely, and he's done it in a lot of different areas, whether it's through blocking certain, things like the Keystone Pipeline. He's done it in a lot of different areas, and I think a lot of folks have probably seen in the news that it's become it's a political issue, and and the things that he's doing from the executive branch, the Republicans in Congress don't like it. They try to block what he has done, and it kind of almost creates a little bit of a stalemate, which I know that a lot of people might be a little bit in tune to. So
I think those are great points. Right, Rob. It's great points, and I think that's right. The President of the United States has always had the kind of to flex the kind of muscle that President Obama has been flexing. I just think it's just been much more politicized under the current climate in Washington. And then getting into specific powers of the president, they're the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They enact and enforce laws and regulations, which we just briefly discussed. The president also vetoes legislation and sets the federal budget. And they're charged with overseeing all of the federal agencies. And in our world, these, the ones that we typically deal with are Health and Human Services, HHS, National Institutes of Health, and the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. And really, the policies and the heads of these agencies are really reflective of whomever the president is. So, it's really another way that the president has another avenue they have for like impacting policy when they're in office. And then the president also conducts diplomacy and represents the United States with other nations, here and abroad, of course. Moving on to the legislative branch of the federal government, which is the U.S. Congress. Just some general facts. There are two chambers, as we all know. It's the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. In the House, members serve 2 years. They must be elected, and this is written into the Constitution and is required by the Constitution. The number of members varies based on the population of each state. And then all members are up for re-election at the same time. So every 2 years, you have to go to the polls and vote for your member of the House to decide who's going to be your representatives in the House of Representatives. Over in the Senate, each senator serves 6-year terms. Each state has 2 senators. They're also elected, but they can be appointed if a senator resigns or dies in office. And in the Senate, unlike over in the House, where they're all on the same schedule, they run every 2 years. Elections are staggered for the Senate, and not all members are up for re-election at the same time. I also think it's just kind of a political point to point out is that where we are now, well, we'll get into that a little bit later, but where we are now, we often have seen over the years, especially like the last 15 or 20 years, but particularly in the Senate, where one seat can make or break the balance of power overnight, literally. So moving on to talk about some of the specific powers of the U.S. Congress. They are charged with introducing and passing bills that change policy on a range of issues, including health care, of course. You use the committee process to move bills through the Congress. In the House, in the work that we do, meaning health care policy, we typically deal with the House Energy and Commerce Committee, or E&C Committee. Over in the Senate, there are 2 main committees that our issues work through, and that's the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, or the HELP Committee, and then the Senate Finance Committee. And then the Congress is also with setting the federal budget and spending priorities in tandem with the president.
So, Zina, I think this is another point here to point out the current events happening as relates to the federal budget and spending, because as we're going to see here in the next few days, we're coming up to the deadline for spending for the federal government. And there is a lot of talk right now of a potential government shutdown. So we're going to be seeing this very issue, the federal budget, the spending, appropriations, funding, center stage in the news as the president and the Republican Congress try to make a deal on continuing to keep the government open.
Great point. The drama never ends these days, I think. So next we're going to dive into the legislative process, kind of an overview of how a bill, becomes a law, and, hearkening back to Schoolhouse Rock days, and I'm dating myself by making that reference. But we're going to talk a little bit about how do you find a bill sponsor and get a bill introduced, the next steps of bill referral and committee action, what happens once you get it through the committee process and it goes to the floor, and then after you get it passed in one chamber, where does it go after that? Conference committee, and then final actions so that a bill becomes a law. So steps to introduce legislation. The first thing you want to do is you want to identify a potential bill sponsor. And depending on the type of work that you're doing, you might be doing this, whether it's, with a group of partners or a coalition. But what I typically do is I kind of have a general idea of what committee my bill, based on the issue, the topic of the issue, what committee it's going to get assigned to once it gets introduced, meaning the relevant committee. And so what I will always do is the first person I go to will be the chair of that committee. And if they say no, maybe it's then a member of that committee, because what that does is it helps you it gives you kind of you're ahead of the game with your starting point, because you've got somebody who's a leader and has power and can, if their name's on it, they can help you move through the committee. In theory, they can help you move through the committee process a little faster. Another thing to look for when you're looking for a bill sponsor is a member who has a connection to cancer, whether they've had cancer, they've had a loved one with cancer, or a close friend. But that usually gives you a starting point, at least to have a discussion about, because those folks are going to have a deeper understanding of the impact of cancer on people's lives. And so they may be much more receptive to, hearing what you have to say, and may have even had, a struggle with the issue that you've identified to try to fix. So that's another type of member to look for. To help, really strengthen your hand and kind of direct how the bill gets written and how the issue gets off the ground, you always want to start by providing your sponsor with model bill language and then key background information, including a fact sheet on the issue, any available statistics that you've managed to dig up in your research, and any other relevant issue background information that you think they need to understand, so that they can be really an ambassador for your issue. If they're going to if they're going to push the bill, they need to know what they're talking about. So really arm them with as much background information as you can. And again, that model bill language is really key, because I've given model bill language to bill sponsors, and they just take the language and give it to the bill drafters, and there might be a few tweaks here and there, but a lot of times the language I gave them is what ends up in the bill that gets introduced. So that's a really great position to be in.
Zina, one point I'd like to make here, I think, for the folks listening in, is that really at the end of the day, it starts with an idea, and you don't have to be a lawyer, you don't have to be a legislative analyst, you don't have to be someone that knows how to write legislative language to come up with a really good policy idea. It all starts with an idea, formulating your idea, thinking about your story and how your idea will help solve or affect and change that story, and taking that idea and bringing it to Washington. And we're here to be a resource for folks at the CSC headquarters here in D.C. If anyone has ideas, we highly encourage you to bring them to us, and we're happy to take a look at them and see if it's a potential a great policy idea that we could shop around to members of Congress.
Great point. That's a very good point, Rob. And then the next thing you need to know is can the bill be introduced in the House, first in the House or Senate? It can be introduced in the House or Senate. Once introduced, the bill gets referred to a relevant committee. And being mindful of the time, I'm not going to breeze through these next slides, but I'm going to move ahead a little bit quicker. So the committee process, the next thing that happens once the bill gets introduced, it'll get referred to, assigned to a committee or referred to a committee, and then it goes into, within that committee there are subcommittees that just drill down on different issue areas. And so you'll have to navigate the subcommittee process, and then goes to full committee for review. Then there's typically a hearing that happens, and usually in this process, the subcommittee and the full committee process, changes are made to the bill that gets introduced, and these changes are what are known as amendments. And then that version comes out. The committee, it gets reported to the committee, and then they vote the bill. They either vote it out or they vote not to vote it out. But if it comes out of committee, then it moves to the floor. Again, on the floor, there will be debate and discussion takes place. Changes can also be made once it gets to the floor with more amendments. And then when it's ready, it goes to a full vote of the membership. If it gets passed by the majority, the bill moves on to the other chamber. And then the process starts all over again with being assigned to committee, review, changes, amendments. And then if the bill doesn't mirror the version passed in the other chamber, it has to go to what's called a conference committee. And then just a special note that revenue bills, meaning bills that involve money, like the budget, they have to start and pass in the House first. But then with our bills, then it goes, once you get it in shape and it mirrors the bill in the other chamber, it goes to the floor in the other chamber for a vote. If it's passed out, if it's approved, it goes to the president, and the president has three options. He or she can either sign it into law, they can veto it, or they can do what's known as a pocket veto. Vetoes can be overridden by 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate. And now I'm going to just move into talking. There's another way that you can impact public policy at the federal level, and I briefly talked about this when we were going over the roles of the president, but it's through the regulatory process. And regulations can be issued by any of the federal agencies, which we briefly mentioned before. And again, in our work, the ones we typically deal with are National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Centers for Disease Control, or the Food and Drug Administration. But all of these agencies, and even agencies outside of this, they're able to issue what's called regulations. These regulations and rules have the same force of law, and all federal agencies may issue regulations in response to new laws passed by Congress. They issue regulations to clarify or interpret existing legislation, and then they do it to implement new priorities. As I've mentioned a couple of times, the ones that we typically deal with are the NIH, and then within the NIH, the National Cancer Institute, also known as NCI, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and then, of course, the CDC. Our next slide is some sample legislation, and this is actually a piece of legislation that the cancer support community has been heavily involved with. HR 6, the 21st Century Cures Act, and I'm not going to go into any detail on this because Rob Goldsmith in a few minutes is going to talk about some very focused work that the cancer support community is doing around this legislation, but then drill down a little bit on an issue within the legislation. But this is an example of a bill at the federal level. This is now we're going to talk about judicial oversight, meaning the power of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court specific powers, they interpret federal laws and protect individual rights as granted by the U.S. Constitution. They also, and sometimes most importantly, they act as a checks and balance between the legislative and executive branches. And I think a really great, very recent example of this check and balance has been around the Affordable Care Act. It's a prime example where, the Affordable Care Act, also known by some as Obamacare, was a very contentious piece of legislation. It passed, and then it got hung up, there were folks that sued around it, and it got hung up in the courts, and it came down to the Supreme Court to make the decision as to whether or not it was going to be the law of the land. And, of course, that was decided in the summer of 2012. But to me, it's a really great, very recent example of a piece of legislation where the Supreme Court acted as a really good check and balance on that. And then the Supreme Court also hears civil and criminal cases, and they settle legal disputes. So moving into the party control of the 114th Congress. Right now, the Republicans control the U.S. Senate as well as the U.S. House of Representatives. They have a very large majority in the House. I think it'll be a good number of years before there'd be a change in that. Not that there needs, but that's just the way the politics are. And then in the Senate, as I mentioned very briefly before, Senate tends to be a little more tenuous, and we've seen the balance of power shift overnight, literally, in the Senate, because usually it comes down to 1 or 2 seats, and then we do have 2 independents in the chamber that helps with that power structure. The cycles of Congress. What does the number 114th Congress mean? That just refers to Congress it changes every 2 years, and every 2 years they give it a new number. So right now we're in the 114th Congress. The number will change to 115th Congress, and will go into they will start up on January 3rd of 2017. Bills get introduced every 2 years in Congress, and so at the end of the 114th, if you have a bill that didn't get passed into law and you get it reintroduced in the 115th, it's going to receive a new bill number. Just a gentle reminder that if you have any questions, to please ask them in the, ask away, because we will get to as many as we can. So where do we start with developing a plan? We've gotten the overview of how the process works, who are the players that we need to impact. So where do we start? We start first. First, you have to identify your problem. Then you need to research your issue, and then you need, through your research, usually what will happen is you'll determine what's the best solution, what's the answer to your issue. So getting started, elements to develop a plan. You always want to start by pulling together a small group of interested folks. In many cases, we call them coalitions or partnerships, but just an interested group of folks that have, they're interested in the same issue that you are. When you get folks together, you determine next steps and draft a timeline, and your timeline should include issue overview and best solution. Identify who your potential champions are, meaning bill sponsors. Outline what your tactics will be, including what events to hold and attracting media attention. And then the ever-present patient stories. And then using the tools we talked about before, how to find them and really highlight them in your plan. Here's some key websites to get you started on your research. United States House of Representatives, United States Senate, and then Congress.gov. Some others, National Cancer Institute, CMS, and then the FDA. And then this is just a sample meeting agenda. When you pull together your small group of interested folks, this is a good outline for what you should think about as you're pulling together that initial meeting to have a discussion around your issue. Strategy, what's the legislative landscape, and then developing an action plan to get things rolling. And then these are just a few kind of fundamental tips for organizing your planning meeting, things to think about. Some more tips for thinking about your meeting. And now I'm going to turn it over to the very capable hands of Rob Goldsmith to walk us through the next several slides on examples of federal advocacy.
Thanks, Zina. So I'm going to take a little bit of time here to talk about a couple of examples of successful federal advocacy efforts and share one story from my past experience as a legislative staffer, and then talk a little bit about the work that we're doing at Cancer Support Community. So the first sample issue here that we're highlighting, it's not actually an issue that has anything to do with cancer policy, cancer care policy. However, it is an example of how anyone can make a difference, and through the use of the right advocacy tools and the sharing your story, which Mike talked about earlier, policy changes can be made. And so this was an issue that I worked on as a legislative staffer for the congressman that I worked for. And the unfortunate thing is that this policy change resulted due to a horrible tragedy. A 7-year-old girl named Caden was tragically killed when she was crossing the road to get on the school bus several years ago. It happened to the congressman I worked for. It happened to Caden was one of his constituents. And she was hit by a pickup truck that had illegally passed a stopped school bus. Well, after this horrible incident happened, Caden's family discovered that many states across the country had low fines for illegally passing a stopped school bus. Some states had fines as low as $25 or $30. So Caden's family started a grassroots advocacy movement that actually started at the state level. They created a website. They brought the issue to the attention of the local news media at various state capitals across the country, and they also used social media to bring light to the issue. Caden's family was successful in passing laws at the state level that increased penalties for those that were found guilty of illegally passing a stopped school bus. The grassroots movement that Caden's family started at the state level caught the attention of both myself and the congressman that I was working for at the time. We heard about Caden's tragic story. It was literally we had saw a local TV news story about it, and we had the congressman go out and meet with Caden's family, and they shared their story with him, and the congressman came back to us in the D.C. office and asked me to take a look and figure out how we could address this issue at the federal level. So what we did was we did a little bit of research, and we introduced some legislation that we named in Caden's memory. We called it Caden's Act. And the bill, without getting into the details of the legislation, what it did was it incentivized states at the federal level to increase penalties for those that were found of illegally passing a stopped school bus. So what we were successful in actually doing was we did implement a policy change, and the Congressman Braley, offered an amendment to a transportation funding bill at the federal level, a funding bill that increased funding for school bus safety programs. And the amendment, and we named it in Caden's memory again, we called it Caden's Amendment, passed the House of Representatives unanimously. And then later we ended up introducing a more comprehensive School Bus Safety Act. So really, again, this, like I said, this was an issue that doesn't have anything to do with cancer care, but wanted to share this with everyone as an example because it highlights that with the right tools and by sharing your story, anyone can be an advocate and anybody can make a difference. And Caden's family was successful in sharing her story in state capitals all across the country. It caught the attention at the federal level, and it was successfully implemented a policy change that provided some money for school bus safety research. So we're going to move on now to an example of some federal advocacy work that we've done here at the Cancer Support Community headquarters in D.C. And one of the most important issues that we're working on here at CSC relates to psychosocial distress screening. Some of you may be familiar with the positive effects that come from screening cancer patients for distress. The research that we have shows that nearly 50% of all cancer patients experience some form of distress. And over 70% of those patients experience this distress over 70% of patients that experience distress report not receiving social and emotional support services. So we believe that screening and providing follow-up care for distress may lead to improved patient outcomes. So that's why the cancer support community authored legislation to include distress screening in clinical trial protocol. And what our legislative language did was it offered an incentive to companies that do clinical trials to provide distress screening and supportive care within the clinical trial process at NIH. So the legislative language that we offered was circulated to members of Congress during the 21st Century Cures Initiative. We met with a lot of different members, with folks from members of Congress on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Senate Health Committee, and met with a lot of rank and file members, and circulated the legislative language, and it was really a great success. And currently, we're also having ongoing discussions, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, with staff at both the FDA and the NIH, two of those agencies that Zina mentioned earlier. And so some of you know, we've also activated the Grassroots Network regarding this issue. We've asked you to contact your legislators, and you've responded overwhelmingly, and we really thank you for that. We've had several hundred members of the Grassroots Network who have contacted their legislators and urged the incorporation of distress screening and follow-up care. And for those of you that have not contacted your legislators yet, I invite you to visit the CSC Grassroots Advocacy website. That's cscadvocate.org. And if you go to the website, you'll see where you can contact your legislator regarding the issue. Great. So, Zina, I think I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you so you can cover the advocacy activities portion.
Great. Thank you, Rob. And thank you for that great overview of those two issues. It's exciting work that CSC is doing on the distress screening. So what are some activities that we can do, and using distress screening as a great example, because it is top priority for the cancer support community. These are some activities that can be generated around, whether it's distress screening or whatever your issue is that you're focused on, that really do help make a difference and push the boulder up the hill. Some tactics: emails, letters, postcards, phone calls, patient stories, the ever-present patient story, district visits, town halls, issue forums, public testimony at public hearings, days, and then building partnerships. All are really important. So this is an example of an email that when there are many ways that you can communicate with federal lawmakers, starting with email. And a lot of times you'll have a relationship usually it's with staff, but where you can send an email to that person. But then there's also with action alerts, which I'm sure all of you are part of Cancer Support Community's action alert system, where you're asked to send an email. And so this is a good example of emails, of how an email can be sent, a sample email to a federal policymaker. Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Zina. So this is our example here of a sample letter to federal policy makers, and this letter in particular is actually to the Secretary of the Health and Human Services Department. So the department that covers both the National Institutes of Health and the FDA. Both of those agencies are located within the bigger umbrella of the Health and Human Services Department. And just a little bit of background here. We have partnered, the Cancer Support Community has partnered with several different patient advocacy organizations to form an alliance called the Alliance for Quality Psychosocial Care. And we sent this letter on behalf of the alliance, so all of the alliance, or most of the alliance organizations signed on in support of this letter. Again, a letter to HHS Secretary Burwell, urging them to develop standards and protocols in clinical trials to screen patients for psychosocial distress. And so what we've asked in this letter is for the Secretary to use all of the regulatory tools and means of implementing a policy change at his disposal to make this happen. And we are going to be in the coming weeks asking you as members of the network to also contact the HHS Secretary Burwell to urge him to do the exact same thing. We think that your voice in this effort will be just as important as your weighing in with her. And so we'll keep an eye on your emails, and we'll be sending you an opportunity, inviting you in the coming weeks to weigh in with Secretary Burwell.
Great, thank you, Rob. So another example of kind of written communications with policymakers is the postcard. Oftentimes, postcards are in the form of an overall campaign where you're trying to generate lots of postcards. And so this is just an example. This is from one that when I worked with the International Myeloma Foundation, they did a very successful campaign, postcard campaign called Postcards for Parity. And so, you know, again, you can use postcards individually, but it's oftentimes more effective in the form of like a campaign to generate lots and lots of postcards that you can then take and, you know, do fun things with them after you've generated like hundreds or thousands of them. So this is a good example. So in any time in your written communications with federal policymakers, there's just a few rules that you should kind of, you know, follow, rules and tips to follow in written communications. This is slide 1 on tips. And here's just a few more tips when anytime you're whether it's an email, postcard, or a letter, things that you should think about as you're, you know, doing written communication. Another great tactic, again, this is often effective. One phone call can make a difference, but it's also a lot of times if phone calls are generated in volume, that's great too. And, you know, you can like pick one day and just do like bombard somebody's office with phone calls. But it's a really effective tactic. So this is just a sample script for making phone calls. And here's some tips that you should follow when making phone calls to federal policymakers' offices. One thing I really want to point out is that when you're making a phone call, always be sure it's in all caps at the bottom. But make sure you give the bill number so that they know. You can't just say what the issue is about because you're trying to get them to like impact them on a specific bill. So always make sure you have the bill number ready and tell them that you're calling to, you know, here's my position on HR 6, but make sure you give the bill number. And then just a few more tips on making phone calls. Tips for conducting district visits with federal policymakers. District visits are events that take place back home. They're often done when we know that, like in a recess or when we know that Congress is going to be on vacation, and we know they're going to be back home in the district. You go in, you call their local office, and you set up an appointment to go in and do what we call a district visit. This is a really great way. Again, it needs to be strategic, but it's a really great way to. And oftentimes to sit down, and a lot of times you'll be able to actually sit down with the member at home, much easier than when they're in Washington. But these are just some tips for when you do sit down with them or their staff back in the district. Some more tips, and as you can see, sharing your story. Always want to share your story in these visits because it's really it's kind of the heart of the issue, and it personalizes it and brings it home. Another thing you can do is to organize a town hall meeting, coordinate an issue forum, and here's a checklist for organizing town halls and issue forums. And they're very similar events, you know, but there are some key differences. But I think that the checklist for organizing these types of events are very the same because it's for the same same type of events. Just a few more tips. The next thing you can do is participate in a federal lobby day. And on this, it would really be in conjunction with the cancer support community. I know they have their fly-in days. They're often known as fly-in days or advocacy days. But this gives you an idea of what, if you haven't participated in one, what a federal lobby day is. And here's a checklist for organizing a lobby day. Again, for many of you on the presentation, you would be attending one that's been everything's been done for you. You just have to show up and go to the meetings that have been scheduled for you. But if you're planning one of your own, this is a good checklist. And then just a few more tips on organizing a lobby day. I'm going to stop here and hand the reins over to Rob again.
Thanks, Zina. So this is just an example of public testimony, and it's a common misconception that you have to be a really expert versed in an issue area, but there have been many cases in specific issues that I've worked on where we've brought in constituents to testify on Capitol Hill on various issues and sharing their story. But wanted to highlight this one because it was an example of cancer support community testifying on the Hill, and it happened in September of 2014. Our Senior Vice President of Research and Training, Joanne Bazaglo, participated in a briefing with other members of the Partnership for Part D Access, which is a coalition of organizations that work towards the collective mission of preserving Medicare beneficiary access to vital medications. And so she participated in this briefing and spoke about the importance of treating the whole patient, the complexity of cancer treatments, particularly for those with multiple diagnosis of cancer and other chronic diseases. So just wanted to share this as an example of some of the work that we've done, the cancer support community, and the specific example of us testifying on Capitol Hill.
Great, thank you, Rob. And so in keeping with that, these are some tips for you if you find yourself in a position where you're giving public testimony. Things that you should really think about and be prepared for. And just a few more tips. And then lastly, in the activities section of the presentation, lastly but not least, build partnerships. There's the old saying, there's strength in numbers, and it's really so true in the work that we do. The issues we work on are hard. We're often going up against powerful industries like the insurance industry. And so, joining hands with other organizations and individuals that, are working on the same issues and care about the same issues, it really can help push you along a lot quicker. So build partnerships, join coalitions, and these are some things to think about as you're looking to start building partnerships. Next, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the media. And in this portion of the presentation, we're going to very briefly talk about earned media and then what's known as earned media, and then social media, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with and active on. But to start, I think, there's the old adage, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? And I think that is a great thing to ask when you're thinking about the media, because in all we've run through the legislative process. We've run through where do you start with identifying an issue. We've talked about some activities you can do once you have your issue effort up and running. But it doesn't matter if you do a town hall meeting, you do a lobby day, you do district visits, and all of these things that we do. One of the most important things that you should always try to do is think about the media angle on it. Because if you hold an event and no one outside of your group knows about it, I mean, not that there's the educational aspect, which is really important, but part of what helps us to get over the hump, if you will, of breaking through the wall, getting legislators to care about and make some change on, move our bill, is get something in the press, get a reporter to write about it. And so what are some ways then that's a good way to shed some sunlight on what you're working on. So here's some examples of earned media. You can do the letter to the editor. There's what's called an opinion editorial or op-eds for slang, news conferences, radio and TV interviews, feature profile stories in newspapers or on TV or on radio, NPR or your local public radio or any sort of radio station, and then, of course, social media and Twitter and Facebook. The next few slides are going to be examples of these types of media that we talked about. So here's a sample letter to the editor. These are some tips when you're drafting a letter to the editor and where to start. Like, how do you even know where to start with, like, submitting a letter to the editor? This is a sample opinion editorial, also known as an op-ed. These are some tips for drafting an op-ed. In both letters to the editor and, again, all media, tell your story or tell the story that, is a big part of your effort. Tell the stories. These are some tips, more tips for drafting op-eds. And this is a sample news release. Very quickly, how do you use a news release? Releases, or you can put out a news release just independent of any sort of event. But oftentimes a news release is written in conjunction with an event. So let's say you're launching your campaign. You got your bill introduced and you're launching your campaign. And so you pull together a group of your partners to hold a meeting on the steps of your stake how you're near your member's office. You invite the member to be there. You would put out a news release to the local media to invite them to attend, and then afterwards to kind of fill in any gaps that they may have missed when they attended your event. Tips to organize a news conference, things to think about. When you do any sort of media, always think about radio and TV, in addition to newspapers. So here's some tips for giving radio and TV interviews. And then there's social media, which is really prevalent, I think, in all of our lives. The cancer support community does a great job on social media. I'm a huge follower of their pages on Facebook and then also on Twitter. So these are some examples of things they've put on social media, but it's every day, many times a day, that they're active. But I think that's, social media is increasingly becoming an important part of the work that we do on both the state and federal level. And these are just some simple tips for using social media effectively. I think one thing I want to point out, and in my own personal use of social media, sometimes I'll put silly things up, but I always try to think, is this true? Is this important? And is this going to make a difference? And especially when you're talking about in the context of a campaign or an effort to change a policy, will this post on Twitter or Facebook make a difference? Is it going to help move the needle on my issue? And that's something you should always think about. And then just some other tips that I think are really important. And then finally, some more resources to some of our recapping what we talked about before, but these are just some resource pages for you to use as you get started. The executive branch. And then just some other final resources. I think one of your best resources on all of this will be the cancer support community. And then taking action, to reach out to CSC or at this email address, and then also Rob Goldsmith, who has been with us tonight, capably leading us, and he's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Cancer Support Community. Those are great ways to get started with taking action. One final, if you have questions, please make sure to type them in, and when we're finished, we can answer any questions that you have. And then I just say thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks so much, Zina. We really appreciate the presentation. Very, very informative, and hope that participants found the information to be worthwhile. In the interest of time, we are going to make sure that if anyone has questions that they've submitted, that I'll be sure to follow up with you individually and make sure that we get your questions answered. And of course, feel free to email me at any point if you have follow-up questions in the future. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have related to any of this material or any of the material in the previous webinars. And again, feel free, we invite you to visit cscadvocate.org to look at those previous 2 webinars that we held. The first one was Grassroots Advocacy 101. The second was Advocacy at the state level. Finally, definitely want to make sure that we recognize and thank our sponsors for the event, Bristol Myers Squibb and Novartis. So thank you to them for their support in making these webinars possible. And with that, I wish everybody a good night, and thank you, and have a good night. We'll talk to you soon.